Welcome to this scientific lecture on chemotaxis and tactic responses of catalytic nanomotors and active colloids. Today we'll explore how these microscopic particles can navigate chemical and physical gradients through fascinating Phoretic mechanisms. First, let me define what we're talking about. Catalytic nanomotors are microscopic particles, typically ranging from tens of nanometers to a few micrometers in size, that can propel themselves through fluids by catalyzing chemical reactions on their surface. Picture a spherical particle with an asymmetric catalytic coating on one hemisphere. This particle sits in a solution containing fuel molecules, such as hydrogen peroxide. The catalytic surface converts these fuel molecules into products, creating concentration gradients that drive the particle's motion. You might ask, why should we care about these synthetic microswimmers? Let me give you an important biological analogy. Living cells, particularly bacteria like E. coli, can sense chemical gradients in their environment and swim toward nutrients or away from toxins. This process is called chemotaxis, and it's fundamental to life. Catalytic nanomotors can mimic this chemotactic behavior, but they're vastly simpler systems. They have no receptors, no signal transduction pathways, no molecular motors. Yet they can exhibit remarkably similar navigation behaviors. Now let's discuss a crucial distinction: self-generated versus external gradients. This is where things get really interesting. External gradients are concentration fields, or temperature fields, that already exist in the environment, independent of the particle. For example, imagine a gradient of nutrients established by diffusion from a source. Here we see an external gradient. The concentration decreases from left to right. A catalytic particle placed in this field can respond to the gradient and move toward higher or lower concentrations, depending on the Phoretic mechanism. Self-generated gradients are fundamentally different. Here, the particle creates its own concentration field through its catalytic activity. The particle consumes fuel on one side and produces products, establishing an asymmetric concentration profile around its. In this diagram, the particle creates its own concentration field. The catalytic hemisphere produces products that diffuse away, creating a gradient that the particle itself generates. This self-generated field is what drives autonomous motion. Now we arrive at a fundamental question. How exactly does a chemical reaction on the surface couple to mechanical motion of the entire particle? This is the heart of understanding catalytic nanomotors. The answer lies in Phoretic mechanisms. Phoresis refers to the motion of particles driven by gradients. There are several types, and understanding them is crucial. Diffusiophoresis is motion driven by concentration gradients of solutes. When there is a gradient of product molecules near the particle surface, it creates an osmotic pressure imbalance that pushes the particle. The diffusiophoretic velocity is proportional to kT over eta times beta times the gradient of concentration. Here, kT is thermal energy, eta is viscosity, beta is a mobility coefficient that depends on particle-solute interactions, and gradient C is the concentration gradient. The sign of beta determines whether the particle moves up or down the gradient. If the particle attracts the solute, beta is typically negative, and the particle moves toward lower concentrations. If it repels the solute, it moves toward higher concentrations. Self-electrophoresis occurs when the catalytic reaction is electrochemical, creating local electric fields. For example, a platinum-gold Janus particle in hydrogen peroxide generates protons at one end and consumes them at the other, creating an electric field that drives motion. This Janus particle has platinum on one side and gold on the other. In hydrogen peroxide solution, the platinum catalyzes decomposition, creating an asymmetric ion distribution. The resulting electric field propels the particle in a specific direction. Thermophoresis is motion induced by temperature gradients. Exothermic catalytic reactions can create local heating around the particle, establishing temperature gradients that drive motion through thermal forces on the solvent molecules. Let's examine more deeply how reaction kinetics couple to the motion. This coupling is non-trivial and leads to fascinating feedback effects. The catalytic reaction rate depends on the local concentration of fuel molecules at the particle surface. This seems obvious, but it has important consequences when the particle is moving. The reaction flux J equals K times Cs, where K is the reaction rate constant and Cs is the surface concentration of fuel. This is essentially Michaelis-Menten kinetics, and the limit of low substrate concentration. Here's where it gets interesting. When the particle moves, it modifies the concentration field around it. A moving particle encounters fresh fuel molecules and leaves behind a wake of products. This is called advection. This creates a feedback loop. The reaction drives motion through Phoretic forces, but the motion also affects the reaction by changing the local fuel supply. This nonlinear coupling can lead to complex dynamics. We can write this symbolically. Velocity is proportional to gradient c, which depends on flux j, which depends on surface concentration Cs, which is itself a function of velocity. This circular relationship is the essence of the reaction-motion coupling. To understand when this coupling is important, we need to introduce a dimensionless number called the Péclet number. The Péclet number equals versus L over d, where v is velocity, L is particle size, and d is the diffusion coefficient of the chemical species. This compares advection to diffusion. When the Péclet number is much less than 1, diffusion dominates. The concentration field around the particle remains nearly symmetric despite the motion. This is the regime most nanomotors operate in because they're small and slow. When the Péclet number is greater than 1, advection becomes important. The particle creates an asymmetric concentration wake, with depleted fuel in front and accumulated products behind. This can enhance or suppress the propulsion, depending on the mechanism. Now let's move to what I find most fascinating: the collective behavior of many interacting nanomotors. This is where we see phenomena that look like self-organization. Here's a provocative question. Can collections of simple catalytic particles with no sensing or signaling capabilities spontaneously organize into patterns and structures? The answer is yes, and it challenges our intuitions about self-organization. Imagine a suspension of many catalytic Janus particles, each self-propelling through the fluid. Initially, they might be randomly distributed and oriented, but give them time, and remarkable things can happen. One dramatic example is spontaneous clustering. Particles can aggregate into dense clusters through purely chemical interactions. Each particle depletes fuel and produces products. Neighboring particles sense these chemical fields and respond. The mechanism works like this. If a particle happens to be near others, it experiences a lower fuel concentration. If the Phoretic mechanism favors motion toward fuel, the particle will be repelled. But if products inhibit motion, particles slow down in high product regions, effectively trapping them together. Here we see a cluster forming. The particles have aggregated into a dense group surrounded by a product-rich region. This is a self-organized structure emerging from simple physical chemistry, with no biological sensing required. Clustering is just one example. Under different conditions, we can see schooling behavior, where particles move together in coordinated groups, or even more complex dynamic patterns. Part of this comes from hydrodynamic interactions. When a particle propels itself, it creates flows in the surrounding fluid. These flows affect neighboring particles, creating effective attractions or repulsions mediated by the fluid mechanics. But chemical interactions are equally important. Multiple particles sharing the same chemical environment create overlapping concentration fields. These fields can guide the motion of other particles, leading to coordinated behaviors. We can write a simple model where velocity of particle I equals its self-propulsion velocity versus 0 times its orientation vector p hat I plus a sum over all other particles j of interaction forces Fij. These forces encode both hydrodynamic and chemical couplings. Now I want to address why this collective behavior seems almost forbidden or paradoxical from a thermodynamic perspective. This is a deep conceptual point. Traditional thinking about self-organization, especially in biology, emphasizes information processing. Cells organize because they sense, compute, and respond. But catalytic nanomotors have none of this machinery. The resolution is that these are non-equilibrium systems that continuously dissipate energy. They're not trying to minimize free energy like equilibrium systems. Instead, they maintain steady states far from equilibrium by consuming fuel. This energy dissipation allows them to create and maintain order without explicit information processing. The chemical and hydrodynamic fields they generate act as mediators of interaction, effectively storing and transmitting information in a distributed way. This diagram contrasts equilibrium and non-equilibrium systems. Equilibrium systems maximize entropy and tend toward disorder. Non-equilibrium active systems, fueled by continuous energy input, can maintain dynamic order indefinitely. This is the key to understanding why simple particles can self-organize. Let me emphasize another crucial aspect: boundary conditions. The behavior of catalytic nanomotors is exquisitely sensitive to boundaries and confinement. When a self-propelling particle encounters a wall, it can't swim through it. Depending on the interaction, particles can accumulate at walls, forming high-density layers, or they can be repelled, creating depletion zones. In confined geometries like channels or droplets, the chemical fields generated by particles can't diffuse away freely. This amplifies the chemical interactions, making collective effects stronger. Confinement can dramatically alter the phase behavior of active suspensions. Let me work through a quantitative example to make this concrete. Consider a catalytic particle in an external glucose gradient used to study chemotactic responses. Suppose the concentration field is C of x equals C0 plus alpha x, where alpha is the gradient strength and x is position. This is a linear gradient. The diffusion-phoretic velocity in the x direction equals negative mu times the partial derivative of c with respect to x, which equals negative mu alpha. Here, mu is the phoretic mobility. If mu is positive, the particle moves down the gradient toward lower concentrations. If mu is negative, it moves up the gradient toward higher concentrations. This is analogous to bacterial chemotaxis, but without any sensing machinery. Typical experimental values for phoretic mobility are around 10 to the negative 8 meters squared per second per molar. For a gradient of 1 millimolar per millimeter, this gives velocities around 10 micrometers per second, which is measurable. Before we conclude, let me briefly discuss why this research matters beyond fundamental curiosity. One exciting application is targeted drug delivery. Imagine nanomotors that can navigate through the body to disease sites by following chemical gradients of disease markers. This could revolutionize how we deliver therapeutics. Another application is environmental remediation. Catalytic swimmers could be designed to seek out and collect pollutants, or to catalyze detoxification reactions in contaminated water. From a material science perspective, understanding collective behavior could enable new bottom-up assembly strategies. We could program interactions to make particles self-assemble into desired structures. More fundamentally, studying catalytic nanomotors helps us understand active matter, which many scientists now view as a distinct phase of matter. This has implications far beyond artificial swimmers, connecting to biology, ecology, even sociology. Let me outline some key theoretical frameworks that have been developed to describe these systems quantitatively. The active Brownian particle model treats swimmers as Brownian particles with an additional self-propulsion velocity. This captures the interplay between directed motion and diffusion. The equation of motion is r dot equals versus 0 times the orientation vector p plus square root of 2 dt times a random noise vector eta. This describes persistent motion with rotational diffusion. For many particles, we can develop continuum theories that describe the density and velocity fields as continuous functions. These typically take the form of coupled PDEs for density and polarization. A simple example is partial rho over partial t plus divergence of rho times velocity equals d times Laplacian of rho. This is a convection diffusion equation that can exhibit instabilities leading to pattern formation. Researchers have constructed phase diagrams in parameter space, identifying regions where you get gas-like behavior, liquid-like clustering, solid-like crystallization, or even more exotic phases like active turbulence. From an experimental standpoint, studying these systems presents unique challenges that have driven innovation in microscopy and particle tracking. You need to track many particles simultaneously with high spatial and temporal resolution. Modern video microscopy combined with particle tracking algorithms can follow hundreds or thousands of particles in real time. Chemical control is critical. You need to establish well-defined concentration gradients or uniform fuel concentrations. Microfluidic devices are often used to achieve this control. One major challenge is separating chemical and hydrodynamic interactions. They often occur together, and disentangling their relative contributions requires careful experimental design and theoretical modeling. Let me highlight some open questions and ongoing controversies in the field. This is an active research area with many unresolved issues. One fundamental question is, what exactly determines the transition from individual particle behavior to collective phenomena? Is it just particle density, or do other factors like the strength of chemical interactions play equally important roles? Another challenge is prediction. Can we look at a single particle's properties, its size, catalytic activity, Phoretic mobility, and predict what patterns will emerge when you have millions of such particles? This remains largely an open problem. There's also the question of universality. Do different physical implementations, platinum gold particles in peroxide, enzymatic swimmers in glucose, thermophoretic particles, show the same universal behaviors, or are the details crucial? It's instructive to compare artificial chemotaxis in nanomotors with biological chemotaxis in bacteria. The similarities and differences are revealing. Bacteria like E. coli have sophisticated chemotaxis machinery. They have membrane receptors that bind chemoattractants, signal transduction cascades involving methylation and phosphorylation, and flagellar motors that control swimming behavior. Catalytic nanomotors have none of this complexity. Their response is direct and immediate, mediated by Phoretic forces. There's no information processing, no memory, no adaptation in the biological sense. Yet both can effectively climb chemical gradients. This suggests that the essential function, navigation in chemical space, can be achieved through very different physical mechanisms. It's a beautiful example of convergent solutions to the same problem. For those interested in the mathematical details, let me provide a slightly deeper look at the theory of Phoretic motion. This builds on classical electrokinetics and colloidal science. We start with Laplace's equation for the concentration field. Laplacian of C equals 0. This holds in the quasi-steady limit, where diffusion is fast compared to particle motion. At the particle surface, we have a boundary condition that depends on the reaction. For a uniformly reactive particle, we might have a constant flux. For a Janus particle, the flux is non-uniform, breaking symmetry. The slip velocity at the surface is given by Vs equals negative k t over eta times the integral over the surface of beta of s times the surface gradient of c. This slip velocity integrated over the surface determines the net particle velocity. The key insight is that you need asymmetry somewhere. Either the mobility beta varies over the surface, or the boundary conditions are non-uniform due to asymmetric reactivity. Without asymmetry, there's no net propulsion by Stokes' theorem. Let me describe some specific experimental observations that showcase the richness of emergent behavior in these systems. Researchers have observed dynamic clustering, where particles spontaneously aggregate and disaggregate. This looks like phase separation, with dense liquid-like clusters coexisting with a dilute gas-like phase. Some experiments have shown living crystals, ordered arrays of active particles that can grow at one end while melting at the other, constantly restructuring themselves. These are crystalline structures in perpetual motion. In quasi-two-dimensional confinement, collections of active particles can form vortex arrays or even turbulent-like flows, with energy cascading across linked scales. This is active turbulence, conceptually different from classical turbulence. Here's a schematic of a vortex structure formed by active particles. The particles circulate collectively, creating a stable rotating pattern. Such structures are ubiquitous in active matter systems. Another useful perspective is to think about effective energy landscapes for active particles. This is somewhat metaphorical but helps build intuition. Unlike passive colloids, active particles don't simply roll downhill on a potential energy landscape. They have their own internal energy source and can swim uphill, so to speak. Yet they do show statistical preferences for certain regions. For example, they might accumulate at walls or in low-activity regions where they slow down. This creates effective trapping, even without binding. The steady-state distribution is generally not Boltzmann. You can have high densities in regions with high effective potential, violating the equilibrium expectation. This is a hallmark of non-equilibrium systems. Mathematically, the steady-state probability PSS of x is not equal to e to the negative u of x over kt. The simple Boltzmann relation doesn't hold because detailed balance is violated. Understanding the relevant timescales is crucial for both theory and experiment. There are multiple timescales at play. The reaction timescale is how fast the catalytic reaction converts fuel to products. This is typically fast, microseconds to milliseconds, depending on the catalyst and fuel concentration. The diffusion timescale is L squared over D, where L is a characteristic length and D is the diffusion coefficient. For micrometer scale particles and typical molecular diffusivities, this is milliseconds to seconds. The propulsion timescale is L over V, the time for a particle to travel its own length. For velocities of 10 micrometers per second and micrometer-sized particles, this is also around 0.1 seconds. The rotational diffusion time is 1 over dr, where dr is the rotational diffusion coefficient. For colloidal particles, this is typically seconds. This is the persistence time of directed motion. For a sphere of radius a, the rotational diffusion time is 8 pi eta a cubed over kt. This scales as the cube of particle size, so larger particles swim straighter for longer. An exciting frontier is designing nanomotors with programmable responses to multiple stimuli. This requires integrating different functional materials and chemistries. By using multifunctional surface coatings, we can create particles that respond to multiple chemical gradients simultaneously. For example, a particle might seek glucose but avoid toxins. Incorporating responsive polymers allows for environmental control. A particle might be active at low pH but inactive at neutral pH, or vice versa. This provides an on-off switch for propulsion. Using light-activated catalysts, we can control when and where particles are active using optical patterns. This enables writing dynamic instructions into the suspension. Catalytic nanomotors are part of the broader field of active matter. Let me connect to some general concepts that apply across diverse active systems. One universal phenomenon is motility-induced phase separation, or MIPS. This occurs when active particles slow down in crowded regions, causing runaway clustering. It's been observed in simulations and experiments across many systems. Another general phenomenon is the emergence of polar order. When particles align their velocities with neighbors, you can get flocking transitions, similar to bird flocks or fish schools, but arising from purely local interactions. In systems with nematic alignment, like elongated particles, you get active nematics. These exhibit topological defects, points where the orientation field is undefined, that can act as autonomous agents, creating and annihilating dynamically. For experimentalists, knowing which parameters to vary and control is essential. Let me list the key control knobs. Fuel concentration is the most obvious control. Higher fuel means faster reactions and typically faster propulsion, though saturation effects can occur at very high concentrations. Particle number density determines how often particles encounter each other. Low density means isolated particles. High density means strong collective effects. The geometry of confinement matters enormously. Quasi-2D systems between glass slides behave very differently from 3D bulk suspensions, or from channels and compartments. Temperature controls both the reaction kinetics and the strength of Brownian fluctuations. Varying temperature can shift the balance between deterministic propulsion and random diffusion. Let me highlight some recent breakthroughs that have expanded our understanding and capabilities in this field. Using super-resolution fluorescence microscopy, researchers have visualized individual catalytic turnovers on nanomotor surfaces, directly linking molecular scale chemistry to particle scale motion. Machine learning approaches have been used to predict collective patterns from time series data, identifying order parameters and phase transitions in high-dimensional experimental data. Development of enzyme-powered nanomotors that use biological fuels like glucose or urea has opened up possibilities for in vivo applications, since these fuels are present in biological fluids. Let me synthesize what we've covered in this lecture and emphasize the key conceptual takeaways. Catalytic nanomotors sit at the intersection of chemistry, physics, and biology. They're chemical reactors, physical swimmers, and functional mimics of biological organisms, all rolled into microscopic particles. The coupling between catalytic reactions and mechanical motion through Phoretic mechanisms is subtle and rich. It involves gradients, boundary conditions, and hydrodynamics in ways that can't be reduced to simple force-velocity relationships. The ability to generate one's own gradients is what enables autonomous behavior. The particle creates its own environment and responds to it, closing a feedback loop that doesn't exist for passive particles. The emergence of complex collective behavior from simple physical chemistry is perhaps the most profound lesson. Without genes, without proteins, without evolution, these simple particles can self-organize into patterns that mimic living systems. This challenges traditional thinking about what's required for self-organization. It shows that continuous energy dissipation, mediated by appropriate interaction fields, can generate order without information processing in the biological sense. Finally, the principles we've discussed, non-equilibrium steady states, effective interactions through fields, motility-induced phenomena, apply broadly across active matter systems, from bacteria to birds to humans in crowds. Thank you for your attention to this detailed exploration of chemotaxis and tactic responses in catalytic nanomotors. This is a vibrant and rapidly evolving field with connections to fundamental physics, materials, science, and biology.